everyone. So, welcome back to another history lesson with me, Ms. Warren. So, today what we are going to cover is the transatlantic slave trade. This is something that we have been building up to for quite some time in AP World. It's something that we've also kind of discussed already with some of the impacts and implications when we went over a little bit more of the Columbian Exchange a couple of weeks ago. So let's just dive right into it. So we are really looking at the changes and continuities of the systems of slavery that were born during this time. So we're looking at specifically chattel slavery. So we talked about the differences in slavery throughout time that we have seen already. And so in this instance, we are really talking about chattel slavery. We're going to start in Africa to see, the forms of slavery that had continued in its traditional forms, and then eventually into the incorporation of slaves into households and the export of slaves out to countries in the world. We're going to look more about the plantation economy and also at other labor systems that were present during this time. So, what explains the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, and what were the consequences of this? Well, we know that traditional peasant agriculture increased and changed, plantations expanded, and the demand for labor increased. That's like the very simplified version of this. So these changes both fed and responded to growing demand of raw materials in the colonies and the finished products in the mother countries. So of all of the commercial ties that linked in the early modern world into the global network of exchange, none had more of a profound or enduring human consequence than the transatlantic slave trade. So when we're talking about the slave trade, we are really talking about the enforcement of humans to leave their homes, be forced onto ships without knowing the language, without knowing or understanding simply anything. So the slave trade before the New World had origins in the earliest civilizations. It was closely linked to warfare and capture. We've talked about this already. Before 1500, the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean were the major arenas of the old world slaves. This is where you saw the exchange of slaves happen. Southern Russia was the biggest source of slaves because the Slav formed the basis of slave, so the Slavic Slav. So the trans-Saharan slave trade actually funneled African captives into the Middle East and into the Indian Ocean basin, both operating within the Islamic world. So we also know that there were forms of slavery in ancient societies, so Roman slavery. This is an example of Muslim slave markets. So slavery is nothing new throughout history. It came in many forms. Sometimes the slaves assimilated into their master's community. Children sometimes inherited slave status of their parents, and sometimes children of slaves were also free. In the Islamic world, female slaves were preferred 2-to-1. The slave trade in the Indian Ocean and Ottoman Empire actually favored domestic servants. Some slaves, even in the Islamic world, had prominent military and political status. Slaves in ancient Rome could also earn their freedom and become politicians and business owners and gain vast wealth. So slavery throughout time to right now, meaning the transatlantic empires or the transoceanic empires, slavery was not new, but you could also get out of slavery in most cases. So Portugal's first steps into forming a maritime empire happened after the Crusades. This is when Europeans had access to sugar that were produced by the Arabs in the Mediterranean. The Slavic people were initially imported, but growth of the Ottoman Empire cut off the Slavic slave trade. because they started using their own people. That's how that works, right? The Portuguese had already had access to West African slaves due to their early contacts because of, their initial exploration. So if you recall, the Portuguese previously established Atlantic colonies, right? Those were Azores Islands and Madeira. Both were known for growing sugar. The Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, even gave permission to enslave those who were pagans or Muslims. Oh, yeah, it doesn't get any better than this, guys. It doesn't. So, why Africa? If slavery had already taken so many forms in other areas of the world using people besides Africans, why Africa? Well, Europeans were cut off from access to the Slavic trades because of the Ottoman Empire. Impoverished Europeans were Christian and could not be enslaved. Indigenous peoples in the Americas were killed off so easily by the diseases. European indentured servants were way too expensive and they were only temporary. So slavery began to be associated with race. So I had you all look at the Las Castas for a reason before we talked about slavery, because slavery has to do with race. And this is where we really start to see the introduction of the superiority complex between white Europeans or Europeans and people of color. The Pope gave them permission to do this. He made it acceptable for Christians to enslave non-Christians by citing pieces of the Bible to support their agenda, to make them feel better about forcing another human being into the worst possible working conditions on the planet. Like, I can't, yeah, nope, I ain't even gonna do it. So the early contacts with, West Africans had to do with guns. The West Africans were interested in the guns that the Europeans had brought with them and other finished goods, specifically from Portugal, because West Africans had initial contact with Portugal. So the cooperation of African elite became really important. They would trade war captives and criminals and other individuals that were expelled from their tribes in exchange for guns. Generally, the young men were valued for their strength. So you see where this is going, right? So Portuguese actually would dominate for over 150 years. And as demand grew, other European nations joined in on the slave trade. And they would establish forts along the west coast of Africa. And slaves were then brought to the coast as military captives or kidnapped. Many times, African states, or many African states, were rivalries and wars produced war captives who provided labor for the victors. Now, what you should also understand is that because human life was now a value, it was now a dollar number, people seeking to get out of their station or seeking to get out of poverty, to live a more comfortable lifestyle would begin kidnapping people. It wasn't even wars that produced captives or wars that produced slaves after a while. It was really people started kidnapping each other and selling them off into slavery. And the ones who benefited the most from this were definitely the Europeans. So European demand actually drove the supply of slaves. African sellers wanted textiles and metal goods, firearms, gunpowder, tobacco, and alcohol. And it became part of a worldwide exchange network. Between 1700 and 1850, this was the peak of the slave trade, and this was due to the American plantation system. It drew slaves from the West and South Central Africa and moved, and they would move into the interior as slaves continued to be in demand. And this is where we start to see the kidnapping of people. So, how was slavery in the Americas different than what we've seen in history so far? Well, it was definitely chattel slavery. It was the immense size of the traffic in slaves. And it centered primarily on this colonial economic system in America, this plantation agricultural system. And the treatment of these enslaved people took the form of just dehumanization. They were less than people. They weren't even seen as people. They were seen as below humans, even below animals. Enslaved people most certainly lacked the rights. They inherited status, social status across generations, and there was little to no hope of freedom. The Atlantic slavery was identified wholly with Africa and race for the first time in history, and things wouldn't change. Social status for the next X number of years would be based primarily off of the color of your skin. And the Middle Passage is one of the, like, every time I start to talk about the Middle Passage, I just want to cry, because the Middle Passage refers to the journey from Africa to the Americas. Slaves in specially built ships, holds on ships, were packed together. Girls and boys and women were all separated for 4 to 10 weeks, and the ships were crammed packed. And the only reason why is because they wanted to maximize their profits. Male slaves were chained together to keep them from jumping overboard. There were special nets placed along the outside of the ship, so if any did decide, they could still catch them. And once under sail, men were kept below deck. And because they were not used to the journey, because they were so packed together, disease ran rampant. Death was, immense. There would be dysentery. Some would refuse to eat. Some would be beaten to death, and some occasionally would be executed. And it's suspected that the Middle Passage is the largest graveyard in the world, because once somebody died on the ship, they were removed and just tossed overboard as if they were trash. Mm. Mm. So this is a graph of the number of slaves that were imported from Africa. And this is, based off of a 25-year period, so 25 years at a time. So you actually see the height of this was 1776 to 1800. What was happening during this time in the Americas? I wonder. So let's look at, the Columbian Exchange a little bit, and why the African slave trade, became a part of the Columbian Exchange. So with the establishment of the Caribbean sugar plantations, this was the primary destination for enslaved Africans. Sugar was used as a form of medicine, spice, it was a sweetener, it was a preservative. And so the European colonies established these massive, large-scale sugar production operations. And they got this idea from the Arabs. And so the Portuguese, because they were the first ones to start all of this, dominated the world market on sugar. And this cash crop transformed the economies of Brazil and the Caribbean. And it became so large that it was a factory-like system. Oh, yeah. So this is one of the things that we have already talked about, in the connection between okra and the slave trade, and how food really transformed the landscape of, the South in the Caribbean, because Africans would bring their traditions here and incorporate it as best as they could. And so a lot of the foods that we may have tried or may have grown up with have African roots. So what were the effects? Well, we know that it occurred for, over 300 years, and it took an estimated 12.5 million people from Africa. About 1.8 million died in the Middle Passage. It disrupted African societies, decimating them for centuries. It's only present day where Africa has really started to rebound on the other side of the transatlantic slave trade, because now Africa, it has, more stable governments in a lot of the countries in Africa. They have got a control on diseases. So now they're starting to see their workforce, and it is suspected that Africa will go through their industrial age in the next 10 to 20 years. So they are rebounding, but look at how long it has taken them to rebound. This also added a substantial African presence to the mix of European and Native American peoples, as you've seen in the Las Castas system. And you have African diaspora, which is this global spread of African people, and it changed race in American society that endures even to this day. It had a profound impact on the way race is viewed and race relations. And there was a huge amount of profit from the slave trade that just enriched Europeans and Euro-American societies. So let's start to have a conversation about the Spanish colonial system, because it really was the Spaniards who would say the rules of the social structure. So at the top, you had the Peninsulars, which were those white colonists from Spain. And then just underneath, you had the Creoles, which were Spanish, but they were born in the New World. Then you had the Native Americans, plus European descent, which was the mestizos. Then you had the Africans with European descent, which were the mulattoes, and the Native Americans and Africans. Why do you think Native Americans were held higher than Africans? Think about that question, because I will ask it in our discussion. So some of these images you may have seen as you were doing the Las Castas activity. One of the things that actually transformed in America was religion, and the new syncretic belief system emerged. It was voodoo, and it was basically formed as an African and Christian belief system that blended these two together to create a new belief. And it is, voodoo is absolutely amazing. So the impacts of the slave trade, you lose millions of young men, creating this sex ratio imbalance. There were less women or less men to women. So men would often end up marrying multiple women. You had labor demands on women that were increased. The slave trade brought about huge political unrest, and violence escalated. And still in Africa to this day, violence in certain regions is still an issue. It slowed Africa's growth, as I've already talked about, the economic stagnation and social disruption. You also have the Manoic and the Kavasa and mace from the New World that added to the food calories. So it changed how they ate. Unfortunately, though, the Manoic was really labor intensive, which added further to the complications of, population in Africa. So most other interior African areas actually were able to remain relatively isolated during all of this. So if you're really looking at listing out the changes and continuities in the systems of slavery throughout this time period in particular, you start to see the size and scale was like nothing history had ever seen before. And it was due to this plantation agricultural system. It was all dominated by Europeans. The demand was higher for males over females because of the physical demands of plantation society. It also shifted to the New World. You started to see slavery change from this freedom is possible system to chattel slavery, which was brutal, generational, and inescapable. And for the first time, people started to really view color of skin and race and linking it to a superiority based off of skin color. Now, the continuities was basically that slavery was the system of slavery as a whole was continuing. You also saw, prisoners of war that were still being captured and, held as slaves. You saw the use of household slaves that were still preferred in many Muslim societies. And then also female slaves were still preferred for domestic roles. And that's pretty much where the continuities end, because the further you dig about chattel slavery and how slavery changed so much in this particular time period, you really start to see more changes than continuities. Another continuity that I would actually add to this would be outside of this time period. So from this time onward, the way races were viewed. So what